The battle that ended an empire didn't begin with a mistake. It began with a decision to wait. On the morning of June 18th, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte stood still while history moved without him. The battlefield soaked from the night's rain, the ground too soft for artillery, the air heavy with delay, and in that stillness, he made a decision that felt reasonable, calculated, even wise. He chose to wait. The cannons would be more effective once the earth dried. The troops would advance faster, the victory would be cleaner, and for an empire built on decisive action, this pause felt like control rather than hesitation. But wars don't pause politely, and while Napoleon waited for conditions to improve, time quietly shifted against him, because somewhere beyond the ridgeline, forces he could not see were already moving closer. The soldiers on the field did not yet know it, but the most important part of the battle had already passed, and no one had fired shot. The battle that ended an empire didn't begin with gunfire. It began with a decision that felt reasonable, controlled, even wise. And on the morning of June 18th, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte stood still while history quietly continued without him. The battlefield near Waterloo soaked from the night's rain, the ground soft and heavy, unsuitable for artillery, and the delay made sense because waiting promised efficiency, stronger cannon fire, faster movement, a cleaner victory. For a commander whose career had been built on calculation and timing, this pause did not feel like hesitation, it felt like mastery. The army waited with him, boots sinking slightly into the earth, men adjusting straps and weapons, watching the sky grow brighter, unaware that these early hours would matter more than anything that followed. Napoleon believed time was something he could manage, something that belonged to him. But time that morning was already working in another direction, because while the French forces waited for the ground to dry, movement was happening elsewhere. Beyond the ridgeline, out of sight and underestimated, Prussian troops were advancing, slower than expected, disorganized in places, but moving nonetheless, and every minute without action increased the chance that they would arrive before the day was decided. On the French side, confidence remained intact. This was not panic or confusion. It was certainty, the belief that waiting was the correct move, that the delay would improve the odds rather than weaken them. Across the field, Wellington's army held its position, prepared not to win quickly, but to endure, because endurance was all that was required. Time was their ally, not their enemy. What made this moment dangerous was not indecision, but confidence, because confident waiting rarely feels like risk. As the morning passed, the pause stretched longer than intended, and yet no alarms sounded, no obvious warning appeared, because nothing dramatic happens when time slips away, it simply goes unnoticed. When the order to advance finally came, it felt decisive. The ground was firmer, the artillery rolled forward, and the battle began with the familiar rhythm of command and response. Smoke filling the field, formations advancing and breaking, momentum shifting but never fully settling. For hours, the fight remained unresolved, and that uncertainty itself was a sign, because Napoleon's victories were usually defined by speed and clarity, not prolonged resistance. Gradually, small problems began to surface, reserves committed earlier than planned, pressure building in places that should have been secure, the need to respond rather than dictate, and that subtle shift marked the beginning of loss long before it became visible. Reports started to arrive, incomplete and hesitant. Movements spotted to the east, shapes forming where none were expected, and the waiting that had once seemed harmless now revealed its cost. The hours spent standing still had not created advantage. They had created exposure, because war does not reward those who wait for ideal conditions. It rewards those who force decisions. Napoleon now faced a problem he had hoped to avoid, the necessity to fight on multiple fronts. Not because the plan was flawed, but because time had been misjudged. The army strained under the pressure, no longer moving according to design, but reacting to events as they unfolded. And once an army begins reacting, control has already slipped away. The arrival of the Prussian forces did not change the battle instantly. It changed its direction, turning uncertainty into inevitability, because momentum, once lost, is difficult to recover. By the late afternoon, the situation had become clear to those who could see beyond the smoke. The battle was no longer about winning, it was about containing loss. And that distinction matters because wars are often decided in the moment when leaders stop asking how to win and start asking how to survive. The collapse, when it came, was not sudden. It was the natural conclusion of hours spent catching up to a situation that had already moved past control. Waterloo is often remembered as a dramatic defeat, the final clash of armies that ended Napoleon's reign. But that framing misses the quieter truth that the decisive moment did not happen during the battle at all. It happened earlier, in the stillness of the morning, when waiting felt safe, when conditions seemed to justify delay, when nothing appeared to be at risk. The most dangerous part of that day was not the chaos of combat, but the calm before it, the belief that time could be paused without consequence. History rarely punishes bold mistakes immediately, but it is unforgiving toward delays that feel intelligent, because those delays disguise their cost until it can no longer be paid. Napoleon did not lose Waterloo because he lacked skill, courage, or experience. He lost it because he waited for the perfect moment in a situation that demanded momentum. And by the time action replaced patience, the balance had already shifted. Empires do not fall only because of poor decisions. They fall because of reasonable ones made too late, because hesitation often arrives wearing the mask of wisdom. And waiting, when it feels justified, becomes almost impossible to question. By the time the consequences of that morning became undeniable, the opportunity to change them no longer existed, and the hours that had passed quietly, without alarm or urgency, had already done their work, leaving behind a battlefield where the outcome was no longer shaped by strategy, but by what had been allowed to happen while no one was moving. And it is at this point in the story, just before the final collapse becomes unavoidable, that the real meaning of Waterloo begins to emerge. Because the battle was never truly decided by the clash of armies. It was decided by the belief that waiting was neutral, that nothing would be lost in the meantime. And that assumption, more than any enemy movement, was what made the end inevitable. Because once time is given away, it cannot be reclaimed. And what follows is not a sudden defeat, but the slow realization that the moment to act has already passed. And this is where Waterloo stops being a story about Napoleon and starts becoming something more uncomfortable. Because once the noise fades and the dust settles, what remains is not a mistake that looks foolish, but a decision that looks familiar, the choice to wait a little longer, to trust conditions, to believe that time is still under control, and history offers no clear warning when that choice becomes fatal. The men on the field could not feel the empire ending in that moment. Napoleon himself could not know that those early hours would outweigh everything that followed, because waiting rarely announces its consequences in advance. It feels calm, justified, even intelligent, until it quietly reshapes the outcome beyond recovery. Waterloo reminds us that the most decisive losses do not always come from reckless action, but from hesitation that feels reasonable, from moments where nothing seems to be happening while everything important is already changing. And the question it leaves behind is not about the past, but about us. Because if an empire could fall in the space of a few silent hours, unnoticed by those who believed they were still in control, how many outcomes in history, and how many in our own time, were decided the same way, not by what was done, but by what everyone chose to wait for and didn't realize they had already missed?